guys, I'm Pranamya and you're watching Pages of the Globe. So if you're new to my channel, basically every single day I read stories all around the world. I give analysis about them, I tell you a little bit about the author, and then I post them on YouTube and you guys can interact with me, you can tell me stories to read, and yeah, we have a lot of fun time here on my channel of like 100 subscribers. It's really fun, guys, I promise. Before you're like, I do not want to see a 10-year-old girl talk about the story, please watch the intro video on my channel. If you don't want to, it literally just talks about how I promise you, A, I'm not 10 years old, and second of all, I actually do know how to read stories and give proper analysis about them. So without further ado, let's get on with the story. Today's story is Cooking Time by Anita Roy. So before I talk a little bit about the story, I'm first going to tell you a little bit about the author, Anita Roy. Anita Roy is a very versatile author, and she's also an editor and environmentalist, which is really cool. And she has a very unique cultural background because she comes from like mixed descent of Indian and British descent. She spent almost like 2 decades in India working with several publishing houses before she relocated to the UK in 2015. Her literary contributions span over various genres, appearing in renowned publications like Granta, Guernica, and Dark Mountain. I'm so sorry if I mispronounced Guernica. I don't know. She co-edited Gifts of Gravity and Light and authored the children's novel Grave Pyre's School for the Recently Deceased. She also holds an MA in travel and nature writing and is actively involved in environmental advocacy in her local community. The story that I'm going to tell you today is called Cooking Time, and it is this dystopian story. It's set in the dystopian future where basically natural food sources are extinct, and so people are relying on these like synthetic food products. And this specific story is actually part of an anthology called Eat the Sky, Drink the Ocean, which she co-edited. And in the story, it's so interesting. It's almost like The Giver. It's like very The Giver inspired. And so everyone eats like this sort of plain basic food. And it's just about how this one girl decides, I'm done. And she kind of does her own thing. And it's about how her best friend like goes through that. And it's actually a very interesting story. So if you are anyone who likes dystopian novels and very much liked The Giver when you were reading it in like the 7th grade, I think, you will probably enjoy the story. Without further ado, let's get on with it. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and comment down below which short story you would like to read next. Cooking Time by Anita Roy. The minute the doorbell rang, I knew that something was wrong. The sound set my nerves jangling as if it was plugged into my brain. My thoughts flew to the box in the basement, but before I could move, Mara had leaped up. That will be Mandy, she said. About time, too. She opened the door. 2 men stood in the street. They had Agro Global written all over them. Dark suits, short hair, clean shoes, mirrored shades. We're looking for Miss Stella Jordan, the first one said. Mara looked back at me, worry in her dark eyes. You need to come with us, he said. I got up. Can I just... now? There was no use protesting. I grabbed my bag and headed out. There was a silver van standing outside. It looked so out of place in our street, like platinum dentures in a vagrant's ruined mouth. Nice wheels, I said. Suit 1 gave a small, tight smile as he held the door open. Where are you taking me? I asked as we pulled out. We drove past the crumbling buildings and old iron staircases, bumping over potholes. Nothing to worry about, he said. That wasn't an answer, but it didn't matter. I knew anyway. There was nowhere in Sector 87 to go, except for Agro Global. At that moment, all I felt was angry. I'd always known that Mandy's obsession would get us into trouble, but would she listen? Never. She would just get that look on her face, biting her lip, her eyebrows drawn together in a line. I'm gonna win, Stella, she would say to me. I know I can cook. The weird thing is, she could, you know. She really knew how to cook. Nobody from the sectors had ever seen real food in their lifetime. It was 50 years since the dying out, 30 since the last great food wars, and 20 since AgroGlobal crushed the last aquaculture smallholding and established itself as the world's largest only manufacturer of artificial food. Nutrition, they called it, which got quickly shortened to Nutri. Nutri, fueling the future, the ads say, with over 70 great flavors to choose from, just squeeze and go. No mess, no fuss, and although I'd like to say no hunger, at least people no longer starve to death. We owed everything to AgroGlobal. They owned everything: governments, armies, energy production, manufacturing, media, healthcare, communications, travel, temporal, and spatial, you name it, they owned it. Everything people needed, and people needed fuel, and we all needed Nutri. That's not to say everyone was happy about it. I mean, look around. But what choice did we have? We all grew up on Nutri. Mara said us younglings were always clamoring for our tubes, but Mandy, she'd have just faded away if Mara hadn't practically injected it into her. She was always the littlest of us, still is. We used to call her 2D, turn her sideways and she'd vanish. I'd always have to remind her to fuel up. Yum, roast chicken and beans and apple crumble, your favorite, I'd say. She'd suck up a bit of her Nutri and then hand the rest to me while Mara wasn't looking. I wasn't complaining. The driver took a right turn out of the sector and onto the highway. I looked out at the dusty, ravaged land that stretched away on either side till it merged with the horizon, and thought back to that day 2 years ago when AgroGlobal TV had announced that the online temporal relocation portal had gone live and that the biggest show on the planet was about to be broadcast, Master Chef of all time. That was the day everything stopped. Schools closed, offices shut down, factories were silent, the skyways were empty. There wasn't a single auto on the streets. Everyone was home watching. It was a reality show to end all reality shows. 12 specially selected contestants were back in time to battle it out every week for the ultimate prize, the Master Chef Golden Apron. In the words of Judge Cheng, we're not just talking real food, we're talking about real cooking. You gotta work for it. You wanna make fish? You gotta catch the bugger first. You wanna roast potatoes? You gotta dig them up. You gotta chop your logs, stroke up that fire before you even think about baking. You get me? It was a seriously great show. We all loved it. Everyone did. But Mandy, she didn't just love it. She was obsessed. She was addicted. She'd stare at the screen as if she was eating it with her eyes. She used to record every episode, play it back in slow-mo, freeze-framing all the time, scribbling away. There were stacks of notebooks and scraps of paper in her room. Recipes, I said to her. I mean, recipes? Seriously? What's the point of recipes if you've got no ingredients? And she'd give me that look again. It was like talking to a wall. One day, we were sitting on the bed waiting for the show to start. I always got that fluttery feeling in my tummy when the music came on, and they showed those clips of contestants in the past episodes, cooking away all over the place. Quail consomme in Victorian England, ragi parathas in Harappa, an entire medieval banquet complete with roast suckling pig and sweet potatoes, and those langues de chat and petit fours in a Parisian salon. It was that episode when they went back to ancient Crete and had a pressure test for calamari dolmas on a bed of rocket and cilantro salad. And at the end of it, Mandy turned to me and said, and I remember this clearly, because it was just the weirdest sentence I'd ever heard her say, I would have had it caramelized, squid ink for the vinaigrette. I just looked at her. What? It would totally bring out the feta, she said, as if I was the idiot. When the show was over, Mandy took me by the hand and stood up. There's something I want to show you, she said. I followed her out of the room and down the stairs to the basement. She moved a pile of broken down crates and reached behind the pipes to bring out a battered old box. It had a long wooden handle, and the flaps on top hinged open, showing neat drawers stacked on top of each other. Inside were an assortment of knives, metal spoons, a long cylindrical thing made of wood, a pair of what looked like pliers with wire mesh at the end, and all sorts of stuff. My tools, she whispered. Then she took out my hand and held it really hard. Stella, I've put my name in for the tryouts. I really thought she'd lost it. Okay, so she had somehow, God alone knows how, managed to collect all these bits and pieces of junk, and she'd read about just everything she could lay her hands on about cooking. But was all just theory. All the other contestants in the whole history of MasterChef had been from the elites, people who had money and resources. Some of them even, so people said, had kitchens. Not that they had much to do in them, but still, being able to play around with different blends of Nutri. They came from a different world. She didn't stand a chance. I was so wrong. She aced the tryouts. At 15, Mandira became not only the youngest contestant to compete on MasterChef, but the only one who wasn't an elite. Imagine one of us, a girl from humble old Sector 7 up there on the screen for all the world to see. Everyone went crazy. Mandira the Marvel, the headlines screamed. Teen cooks her way into history. Mandy became star overnight. She came back after a month, and she was glowing. Seriously. She couldn't stop talking about all the food she'd eaten. Oh my God, Stella, she'd say, the peas, you could pick them like this. She pinched her fingers together and twisted, and then popped the pods. She flicked her thumb and index together and just eat them straight, and oh, they were so... And she'd put her fingers on her lips like she was remembering the sweetest kiss, and she'd be lost for words. A month later, the first round was broadcast. Practically the whole block came over to watch. You should have seen her prep that halibut. Most people hadn't even seen a fish, not outside Planet Ocean Aquarium anyway. But she had that fish deboned and on the slab as if she was born with a, what did she call it? A lithium ion fillet knife in her hand. What a party we'd had that night. And the week after that, and the week after that, until all the contestants had been eliminated one by one, and it was down to the final three. Jerome with the floppy hair, Shurna, the big boned girl from Sector 47, and our Mandira. When she left early this morning for the shoot, she seemed a little distracted, I guess. I put it down to nerves. I mean, even Mandy has got nerves. But now I'm not so sure. Before she left, she took me to one side. Stella, I'm going to beat them all. I'm going to win, she said. It wasn't even a question. Sure you are, Mandy. You're the best, I said. Although I meant it, not just that she was the best cook, but that she was the best, my best friend. It came out sounding pretty lame, even to me. But now, as the silver van approached the shining steel gates of Agro Global headquarters, I wondered if she had meant something else altogether. A security guard scanned our ID chips, and the gates slid open. The van drove up the main gate, and my guys, the suit, got out with me. They walked me to the entrance, one on either side. A gray-haired man was waiting for us. He introduced himself as Professor Gulati, head of nutritional research, and shook my hand gravely. Thank you for coming, he said politely, like I'd had any choice. We need your help. Sure, I said. What's this? It's Mandira. She's a friend of yours, I believe. The thing is, he coughed slightly, she's disappeared. I felt like my brain had just fused. What do you mean? That's not possible, is it? I mean, isn't that supposed to be impossible? I mean, you've lost my friend? Calm down, Miss Jordan. I am calm, I shouted. What about the tracker, the implants that they had put in all the contestants before they entered the portal? What about the safeguards and the rules, scanning, and the regulations? There had been a ton of them, all ratified by the international treaty. Nothing was allowed in or out of the portal except the contestants. They were stripped and scanned before each episode. We'd had it drummed into our heads forever. Messing with time was a serious business, and nothing could be allowed to destabilize the chronologic. One little mistake and our whole present could disappear, whoop, into its own wormhole. I was too busy freaking out to notice my surroundings, barely registering the long gleaming corridors and glass archways. Professor Galati finally stopped at a door and then held it open for me. We'd like you to take a look at the footage, he said. Maybe you can spot something we've missed. You knew Mandira. I seriously didn't like the way he was talking about her in the past tense. We think she may have been planning this. She wouldn't! But as I yelled, a vivid picture flashed in my mind of Mandy. That stubborn, crazy look she'd had in her eyes, and I knew she would. She totally would. Mandy, you idiot! What have you done? I groaned inwardly. You are in some sort of insane trouble. Inside the screening room, there were about 5 or 6 other men and women, already sitting around waiting for me, it seemed. There were desks and a large screen. Professor Galati ushered me into a chair and then turned to a guy wearing headphones sitting across one of the consoles. "Roll the film," he whispered. And then, as the lights went down, he leaned across me. "Rural Punjab, 2014, he whispered. "All of this is unedited footage, shot this morning." Jerome looked a bit awkward in his long shirt, and he kept tripping on his baggy trousers. But Mandy looked really good on screen. She and Sherna were wearing long tunics and loose trousers, gathered in folds around the ankles. Mandy's top had spangly mirrors and embroidery on it. It was really colorful against her cocoa-colored skin, and she looked, well, I had to admit that skinny old 2D looked quite beautiful as she stood there listening to Judge Kumar explain the challenge. Maki ki roti and sarson ka saag lunch was for 14. 45 minutes to prep, cook, and plate up, he said. The presentation was what Judge Dingle called fast and dirty, but it still had to be spot on. The steel plates shiny, the tumblers filled to the brim with frothy Jeera spiced lassi, and the ghee had to be made from scratch. It was tough, but it was supposed to be. Each contestant was at their cook station in a different section of the screen, shot at different camera angles. The clock was ticking, and my heart seemed to beat a shade faster as I noticed that Sherna was falling behind. Jerome was already dry roasting his spices to season his sarson ka saag, which lay in a bowl in a smooth bottle green swirl. Mandy was rolling a wooden spindle expertly between palms of her hands to whip the curd for frothy lassi, but Sherna was still struggling to get the right consistency for a roti dough. I heard one of the judges mumbling off scene and then out loud, "You might want to add a bit more flour, love. 13 minutes to plate." She looked up, smearing one hand across her forehead and streaking her hair with dough. Come on, I found myself muttering under my breath. Of course I wanted Mandy to win, but, well, it was impossible not to want all of them to make it. I glanced back to Mandy's corner of the screen, and it was empty. There was a lot of commotion on screen, people shouting and running, the camera careening all over the place. And then the screen went blank. When the lights came on, Professor Galati turned to me. "Well, did you see anything? Anything at all? Something we might have missed?" I don't understand. I shook my head. She couldn't have just disappeared. What about the tracker? We found the tracker. I winced. But no sign of Mandara. Professor Galati stood up. "What did she say before she left? Did you notice anything different in her behavior?" I shrugged. "No." "Miss Jordan, you do realize the seriousness of what has just happened. The chronologic may have been compromised. We'll no longer know what happens." "Well, surely if something had happened, then shouldn't we already know about it by now? Everything feels kind of the same to me. You're still here, I'm still here." They asked me all kinds of questions about Mandy, and I answered them all. Well, most of them anyway. What I really wanted to do was get back to somewhere dark and quiet where I could think. It was late at night when they finally dropped me back. More and the others were relieved to see me, but I couldn't face any more questions. I had a Nutri and then slumped off to bed. I laid there for hours, it seemed like, until the house was still and silent. Then I crept downstairs and opened the door to the basement. I moved the crates and reached behind the pipe. I pulled out the shoebox and opened it. Right on top lay a piece of paper. I unfolded it carefully and smoothed it out. "Dear Stella, I guess by now that you know I've gone off-grid. I don't know if you'll ever forgive me, but I owe you an explanation. It's the least I can do. When I go to MasterChef today, I'm not coming back. I decided I can't live like this anymore. You remember in school they taught us all about the dying out? Years before it happened, this guy called Einstein said that if the bees disappeared, mankind would only last another 4 years. Well, he was wrong about that. Maybe we would have died out if it hadn't been for Nutri, but we're still here. You're still here. I know all about the chronologic. I know it can't be changed, but I've asked myself, why? Why can't we change history? I've been in the past, Stella. I've eaten fresh strawberries, I've bitten apples, I've tasted freshly baked bread with a hunk of creamy brie. I've licked tandoori chicken masala off my fingers and drunk peppermint sherbet. Maybe I can't change anything, but I know I've got to try. Perhaps if people know what life will be like without the bees, they'll be able to do something about it. I don't know. All I do know is that I want to live my life. And if I can't cook real food, I might survive, but I think I'll die. Look after yourself, my darling Stella Bella, and know that I'll always be your best friend forever, Mandy, XXX. I couldn't believe I would never see her again. That was my friend who I saw this morning. Was just not dead, but that she could have died 100 years ago. I tried to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself filled with a strange, insane, bubbling, uplifting feeling. The chronologic was broken, or if not broken, then at least cracked. And through that little crack, the light came in. Mandy, what on earth have you started? And then I started to laugh, because I know that even though everything was exactly the same, nothing ever would be ever again. The end. Alright, so that was Cooking Time by Anita Roy. Now, I found this story very interesting. I will say, before I jump straight into the analysis and summary, I will say I found the story interesting because I have written a very, very, very similar story to this story a couple years ago when I was in 6th grade, and it was awful. It was so bad. But it was very similar to this story, and I just thought that was so interesting because before today I had never read it. So it was so shocking to me. It was almost the exact same. And I mean, it's never been published or anything, so I am not accusing Anita Roy of stealing it, but I have never read this story. And it was the way she was talking about the government and how they're all everything is super controlled and everyone eats the same thing and there's not a lot of flavors. That's exactly how my story was, and I just found it so interesting. However, at the end of towards the end, there's no master chef in my story, but still I just found that so interesting how authors can have sort of the exact same idea, maybe even around the same time, but it can end up as such different things, because my story ended with this really weird way. It was awful, honestly. It was not that amazing, but Anita Roy's story just really draws the reader in. So I want to talk about it. Now, in the story, let's do a very quick summary. Now, we have the narrator, and she's basically talking about how she has this best friend, Mandy, who, since the very beginning, she was never really interested in the nutri food that they give, because to her it was very bland or whatever. She was very thin because she didn't like it a lot. And she talks about how in this sort of dystopian era world that almost reminds the author of stories like The Giver, everything is controlled and you really just get 3 meals a day. I'm not sure exactly how many. But they're all this sort of bland type of, what I'm assuming sludge almost, that's flavored, and you drink it or eat it, I don't know, through a feeding tube. And so obviously Mandy is just not very much into it, even though she's never known anything else her entire life. Now one day she kind of she really gets into cooking because she watches this show called MasterChef. And after a while, she decides to try out herself. And she makes it, and she's so good at cooking. She knows how to do everything. And what the producers of this TV show do is that they created this time machine that allows the contestants on MasterChef to go back in time. In case you didn't really understand, basically what the chronologic thing did was that it let the contestants go back in time to, for example, Bangalore in 2014, and be able to cook food then, because then they still had access to fresh fruits, vegetables, spices, things like that, which they don't have access to right now. And that's how they cook, and that's how they have the show. Now, at the very last trial, Mandy is in the finalists. She's so good, which is shocking because she's from Sector 87, which is a very poor, not really great kind of place, and she's competing against elites, which almost reminds you, that sort of system almost reminds you of like the Hunger Games, or this is gonna sound so weird, but it sounds to me like this book series I used to read when I was way younger called like The Selection, which was like this fantasy romance series that all the girls in my grade read. But in that, they had like, there were people called like 7s, 6s, 5s, 4s, 3s, 2s, and 1s. And then like the higher up numbers were like the elites. So you can definitely see there's a lot of like influence that comes from other stories in this specific story. But anyway, yes, so the elite, she's competing against, Mandy is competing against the elites. She's so good. But the last trial, she just disappears. And she writes a letter to her best friend, and she's like, hey, you know what? I've had enough of this. I'm going to leave. I need to change the world. I'm going to change the way we live. Now, I have to say, I honestly found a couple issues in this story, even though it was great. It was amazing. However, it felt kind of awkward to me, especially because Mandy talks about changing the future and whatnot. But the biggest thing to me was that as soon as she disappeared, the timeline would have changed. If she actually did something, like, the narrator would not exist anymore. That entire thing wouldn't have happened. But it was still alive. Nutri still happened. Because at the end of the day, the narrator still got interviewed and all that. They still, like, interrogated her about what Mandy might have been up to. So Mandy didn't really change anything. She just kind of, like, gave up, and it was almost, to me, it felt almost selfish. Like, and yeah, good for her. Like, good for you, you left. But also, you left all your family, all your friends. But, like, yeah, sure, go ahead and go off to Bangalore in 2014. Now, going into more of an in-depth analysis, because that was honestly just my opinion, we see this character, Mandy, kind of stand up for something she believes in. Because in her world, all the joy that comes from eating, she is obsessed with it. She even talks about how, in her letter, she's like, oh, I would have survived on eating Nutri, but I would have died. Which, at first, you're like, what? But then it's very obvious that she's just saying, like, yeah, my body might have survived, but my soul, like, my inside, my heart would die. Because all I really love is food and like eating and cooking and just like the culinary arts. And so she's so obsessed with this that this loss of art, the lost art of real food, that she rejects this modernity and she goes off the grid. Now, most people are just living life eating this paste called Nutri, and people want better food, but they don't do anything to change it. But Mandy's different because she genuinely tries. Does she succeed? No, I don't think she does, because the future is the exact same, or I guess I should say present. And on top of that, not only did she not really change anything, something that I think is so interesting is she may be a really good chef, like in the present, but I mean, the optimist in me doesn't want to believe this, but she might really be the best in the world only because, like, at the time, they just had no experience with food. But, like, I'm so interested to see, like, I would love to have, like, a spin-off story with how she survives in the real world. Or when I say real world, I mean, like, during our time. Because I want to see, like, first of all, how are you living being homeless in India? Second of all, how are you going to get to the MasterChef that's in India? Because MasterChef is a real show. And it's very big in India. And third of all, if you don't go on MasterChef and you do end up being like a chef or something, how is that going to work? Are you actually going to be good? Or were you just good back then, like in the future, because everyone else was bad? I'm so interested in that because that's really all I was thinking about. But anyway, yes, so Mandy is enthralled by this MasterChef show because it gives her this path of like rejecting this hyper-efficient food of the present, and she actually gets to enjoy real food. And while she's watching the show, she's not actually eating it, but just that sort of, she's living vicariously through it almost. And it's so interesting to see how she like writes all these recipes, and the narrator talks about how she debones a fish so fast, even though she's never even seen one before, which was so insane to me because it's like that you really have to be paying attention to every single thing in that show to learn how to cook. I mean, I've seen my mom cook in the kitchen so many times, and I don't even think I know how to, like, boil water. Like, if I told you how many times I've, like, burnt the pot that was boiling the water and, like, all the water has evaporated, like, it's actually so embarrassing. So it was very inspiring to hear how Mandy, this teenage girl, was able to learn all about the culinary arts. And it's so interesting to see how she rises above this poor background. She surprises everyone by qualifying for the competition. Now, honestly, I will say this analysis that I'm about to give, it's not, or I have been giving, it's just not very deep. And I think this might be the first time I actually critique a story. But to me, it felt sort of juvenile. The story is read to high schools all across America. But the more I think about it, the more I'm like, I don't think it's a high school level story. Just because I do like to read short stories that, you know, kids in school will read. But it just felt so like basic to me. I mean, I was shocked to see that, first of all, this idea was an idea I had in 6th grade. Now, this idea could have been developed into something that's so complicated, but it really wasn't. And the ending was sort of a letdown for me because, okay, Mandy goes off the grid, and that was like this culminating part because we're like, oh my god, like, she might actually change the world. But then as we come to the end, she's just like, yeah, you know what? I've had enough. I'm leaving. Like, bye. And it just felt like a cop-out almost. And it didn't feel like the story was complete. And I didn't see a lot of like deep metaphors in this. It just felt so basic, boring, and bland. And maybe that's because I'm drawing comparisons to books like The Giver, where, yes, in The Giver, the main the protagonist, he leaves, but then he changes everything. And I think because I didn't get to see that and the readers didn't get to see that, it just felt like, oh, great, like, it just felt like a very two-dimensional dystopian story. And so is this an analysis? Maybe not. Is this a criticism? Definitely. Is this me critiquing it? Yes. If you have a genuine analysis, please feel free to comment it down below. But that is all I'm going to say about this. It was wonderful being able to share the story with y'all. And yeah, remember to like, share, subscribe, and comment down below which short story you would like me to read next. Bye!